Okay. All right, shall we start? We already have 10-ish people. Okay. Hello, everyone. A warm welcome to today's webinar on archetypal geometry. My name is Chaitali, and I am the co-founder of Land and Site, which is dedicated to deepening relationships between the living Earth systems. It's an absolute honor to have you all here today as we embark on this fascinating exploration of geometry as a living, breathing connection between ourselves and the natural world and the spaces we inhabit. This is also Land and Sight's first offering to the world. We are recording this call, so if any one of you doesn't wish to be recorded, please feel free to be off the camera. And I request everybody to turn your mics off as well. We will have a Q&A segment towards the end, so if you may have any questions or comments, please speak during the Q&A segment, and the chat is always open for pressing ideas. Before we begin, please allow me to speak a little about Land and Sight. At Land and Sight, our mission is to create learning opportunities that bring together the wisdom of land and the skills of conscious design. Our courses, workshops, and webinars aim to inspire and equip people with knowledge that fosters respect to the land, whether you are a designer, a permaculture enthusiast, or simply someone seeking deeper connections with the world around you. This webinar is a part of our journey to explore ideas that shape a more sustainable, thoughtful, and beautiful way of living. Even if you're not planning to join this course, today's webinar will offer valuable insights into a subject that has power to transform how we see and shape the world. So, why are we hosting this webinar and offering a course on archetypal geometry? When I first learned about archetypal geometry, Jeremy said that this requires no measurements, and I was quite intrigued by that. And as my learnings in this subject got deeper, I had many eye-opening, significant experiences which are worth sharing. So I am bringing this present to you all. Geometry is often seen as rigid, just lines, angles, and shapes, but in truth, it's dynamic, alive, and deeply interwoven with the natural patterns that shape our world. The follow-up course is about understanding geometry not only as a visual or mathematical tool, but as a language of life, one that guides us to be more aware of dynamic shapes and forms we inhabit in and being in conscious relationship with the living earth systems. By the end of the short course, participants will gain a deeper awareness of how geometry can inspire their thinking, design, and being. And before introducing our speaker, I would like to take a moment to thank the Institute of Relational Being and its co-founder, Joe Culhane. Joe has been an incredible supporter, helping me structure my vision for Land and Sight. IRB has provided technical support for this webinar and the course, and I encourage you to explore their work. I wonder if Joe is around and if he would like to speak a few words. Hello, Joe, I see you. Would you like to speak a few words about IRB?
Hello. Hopefully my internet is working. It's sure. Thank you. This is very exciting to participate and help host this for you, Chaitali, and it'll be nice to meet you, Jeremy. Thank you for facilitating this as well. Just wanted to say IRB, the Institute of Relational Being, is a open experiment. It's really a organization that is a legacy project of Schumacher College, and it has the same shared ethos of a head, hands, and heart kind of way of learning, living, and being a part of nature and this living world. And uh, the idea is to institute more and more ways of being in relationship with the rest of life. And so we're doing that today through the wonderful power of technology and internet. So I'll just leave it there. Anyone who wants to reach out, please do. We love collaborations. And yeah, thank you, Chaitali, for having me be a part of this with you.
Thank you, Joe. It would be helpful if you could put the website in the chat so if anybody is interested further, they can take a look. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Jeremy Strawn. Jeremy is a philosopher, teacher, farmer, and a geometer. He lives in Northern California. In 2015, he completed an MA in philosophy at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where he focused on the relationship of geometry to epistemology and the evolution of consciousness. Prior to that, he earned a BSc in biology and has many years of experience working, teaching, and managing farms. Since 2007, he has been teaching geometry to high school students and adults, taking them on journeys into geometric landscapes outside the conventional Euclidean and Cartesian framework. So over to you, Jeremy.
Okay. Hi. Good morning. Well, it's morning here anyway. This is very exciting. This is what I love the most. This is I feel like a long time ago just came to me. This is just the reason I'm on the earth in this incarnation is to just open up people's eyes and to the possibilities of geometry. And yeah, just briefly how I got into archetypal geometry was, well, it's a long journey, but it all started with going to school right after college and realizing that our world was suffering in a lot of ways, and I realized that school wasn't really helping me very much with any solutions, just providing insight into the problems, and so I ended up farming and discovering biodynamics, which, if you're not familiar with, it's a system of agriculture that was started by a man in 1924. And it's kind of the precursor to anything organic or holistic. It's a way of farming that looks at the entire farm as an organism and an attempt to contain the fertility from the animals and the plants into a closed loop cycle. But more significantly, it's a system of agriculture that works with forces that perhaps aren't necessarily identified yet by conventional science. So, the movements of the planets and the stars and um, how those affect plant growth is a big part of it. Also, the use of kind of alchemical herb medicines, essentially, for enlivening and awakening the earth to being sensitive to these forces. So, after spending some time farming, I went back to school to study biology, but also to sort of grasp what is wrong, in my opinion, with the conventional scientific paradigm. How can we transform it? And along the way, I discovered this system of geometry called non-Euclidean projective geometry. Most people probably never heard of it. Um, and that's something also that Rudolf Steiner suggested that people look into further, and that's what I did. And then I ended up teaching it in high school and realizing that the ideas contained in this alternative form of geometry are so monumental, so world changing that that's what inspired me to go back to graduate school and kind of grasp how this geometry might be a part of the larger cultural conversation. I think a lot of people are involved with it, which is how do we get out of the situation we're in now? How do we transform our thinking? Um, and something that I always think about when I introduce this is this notion that, at least in the Western world, Euclidean geometry has been basically the thinking and operating system for the last 2,000 years. And if anybody, basically, I could be wrong, but essentially, I think anybody in the world that gets an education gets taught Euclidean geometry. It's it's essentially, I don't know, like a perennial byproduct, yes, of it's a system of thinking that we basically force every single student in the world to learn. And uh, it's kind of outdated, and I think a lot of the issues that we see in terms of environmental and social alienation and disconnection stem from this way of thinking that's embedded in the geometry that we've all been taught. So my goal with this geometry is to deconstruct that way of thinking and to open up vast other possibilities, which has huge potential in medicine and farming and design and in just so many ways, because it's a fundamental shift in how we interact with the world. So those are just a couple things I'd say at the beginning. Um, did I miss anything, Chaitali?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, go on.
Go on. Okay, so what is archetypal geometries? Um, Generally, nobody knows what this is. So, um, one of the important things to realize is that there's no measurement, there's no calculations, there's no forms, there's no numbers. Um, Most of the geometry that people do has to do with the measurement of forms, like the sides and the lengths of a triangle or a square, or the trigonometry involved with calculating the physics of you know aerodynamics or um, physical forces. And a lot of that is rooted in Cartesian coordinates and Euclidean geometry. And this geometry is about the process. It's about the interaction of points and lines and planes that happen prior to any sort of form. All form is movement come to rest. So how do we participate in the movement before we start measuring things? And one of the challenges with this type of geometry is you can't really talk about it. I mean, you can't look at it, because once you look at a finished drawing, for example, something like this, and you can see it's just simple. Hope you can see that. A little something. Um, the thing is, what you just saw is the dead remains of the activity. It's the actual drawing. It's the weaving together of the points and the lines that you have to do to witness patterns and fundamental geometric laws of the universe, essentially. Um, but you can't see it when it's frozen. It's something you have to draw. So that's the way I like to approach this topic, is to do it all experiential. So this entire course that we are putting together it's all drawing, or 75% of it, and the rest is discussion. Um, it's I think of it like a consciousness yoga, because you have to be present and participating in the unfolding of these patterns. And what you find is that you're tapping into kind of a layer of the universe that's independent of human um, projection, I guess, which isn't entirely true. It's impossible to separate human projection. But what this does is brings your own perspective into context with the geometric unfolding patterns. And that's the thing that modern geometry tends to um, hide, the fact that we are always participating in our conception of the world and the spaces around us. And it's an illusion to think there's this objective way of describing space. And so what this geometry does is it brings that awareness to our participatory role in a much stronger way. And um, yeah, changes a lot. Let's see what else to point out here. One of the things about this geometry is that it started with the Renaissance artists of the 1400s. The birth of linear perspective um, the artists were the first ones to work out these laws of perspective, and in doing so, they discovered really many fascinating aspects, which then mathematicians um, looked further into. And essentially, you can compare a Newtonian physics with a Cartesian Euclidean geometry system. And the birth of non-Euclidean projective geometry, essentially in the 1800s, are what laid the foundation for quantum physics and all the revolutionary thinking that entails. That was entirely possible only because non-Euclidean projective geometry was able to kind of free um, the structure of thought that was being utilized at the time. And unfortunately, to me, the only people who really encounter this type of geometry are academic mathematicians, or say, very advanced physics uh, physicists. And so most people don't have any way of encountering these ideas. And if they did, which I welcome you to do, you can Google this, and all you'll find is some really cryptic, abstract language and almost no ability to understand what they're talking about, because it's entirely in this mode of academic jargon and requires you to have undergone this training in their way of thinking. And so my goal is to uh, not do that, to make it possible for anybody and everybody. There's no um, previous mathematical ability whatsoever required. In fact, some of my favorite students are always the ones who say, I'm not good at math, or I don't know how to do math, or I used to be, but something went wrong and I stopped doing math entirely. That's just an unfortunate consequence of the approach that people have all taken in terms of geometry. Um, and one of the also very interesting things is that in order to really get outside conventional Euclidean geometry, you have to go to the limits of your own thinking. No matter how experienced or how intelligent you think you are, I guarantee you, and I've done this so many times with these exercises, is one's ability to understand will break down. It will fail. I call it hitting the wall of unknowing. And it's perfectly natural and a totally expected aspect of this geometry, because by necessity, we are pushing our thinking beyond the confines of what we've previously been taught. So it's going to have to get a little uncomfortable, but it's worth it, because on the other side of that wall, when your imagination expands to include a different way of looking at things, all new layers of reality become apparent. And it's my big mission to open up these layers so that we can actually start utilizing them in our design and our farming, and even in our plant medicine. Um, in a lot of ways, this geometry and the world that it opens up is resonant, or sort of reflective of an ancient wisdom that essentially has no place in a modern scientific paradigm. So we're living with these challenges right now because there's, at least what I see, is people are reclaiming a lot of indigenous or ancient wisdom, but now we have these insights that we know to be true for thousands and thousands of years, and then we have this modern sort of very materialistic paradigm that has no ability to acknowledge or to include those elements. And this, I think, provides the kind of um, foundation to synthesize these things, which to me, in my studies of the evolution of consciousness, this is where we're trying to get to. We're trying to break out of these these binaries and these rational mental structures, not to abandon them, but to advance them and to move them forward. And to me, this geometry, by taking that clarity of thought that's typical of mathematics, but then freeing it from its limitations, is the possibility of well, it's a whole new future. It's a whole new, to me, this is the operating system of the future. We just are trying to get there. We're making our way right now. Um, and so, yeah, those are a few of my key ideas that I'd like to put out there. Any, did I miss anything? Or any, Chaitali, anything I should follow up with?
I wonder if you'd like to speak more about the Cartesian framework and how do we think that it is, not think, but we know, how do we know that it is limiting us in some ways, and how do we now engage with it?
Uh, well, one thing I've noticed over the years is how abundantly designers or architects and the spaces that we live in are dominated by right angles. Essentially, we're just living in boxes everywhere all the time. Now, obviously, there's great exceptions, and we could look at those perhaps at least in our course. But this predominance of right angles is just a reflection of this way of almost like shaping space essentially as just measurement of units, inches, feet, kilometers, meters, centimeters, whatever it is. We tend to imagine space, or at least the spaces that are designed around us, are a projection of this view of space where that's just static and dead and uniform. And when we inhabit spaces like that, I think because they're so common, um, we don't necessarily become conscious of how it's reinforcing a connection from the world around us. From but ultimately, it creates a disconnection in our own self in relation to other people. Um, it's like an embedded form of disconnection that, as much as we want to heal and reconnect, it's like we're still living in these spaces that reinforce that, even if we don't want that to happen. And so, um, the Cartesian system of rational, regular units, um, what you come to realize through exploring this geometry is that really is a projection of certain assumptions that aren't true actually about space. They're not inherent. Space is not inherently uniform and measured in discrete units of inches or centimeters or what have you. That's a human creation. Um, and so um, this geometry allows us to tap into what I would call like the true nature of space, which is fundamentally dynamic, fundamentally flexible, fundamentally um, alive, and teeming with different kinds of forces that don't simply um, generally project from a center, like a force of gravity, for example. Um, so by deconstructing that Euclidean Cartesian framework, we open up the imagination to the possibility of other kinds of forces and other ways that space can be structured that are, in a sense, more like the way things are. Um, and this, one of the things that happens, the way to get there is to uh, start with chaos. I think of this geometry as kind of like, what would the geometry of the world be doing if we could get out of the way? Could remove all things created and allow this layer of reality to unfold of its own design, essentially. What are the laws and principles at work? that you can truly say this isn't a human construct, it's a universe, it's an archetypal quality. So that's something that becomes readily apparent when you do this geometry. But again, unless you've experienced it, it's hard to realize. It's like asking a fish to describe the water. Just so embedded in it. And one of from someone else's, but the process is the same. And in that regard, it sheds light on the geometry of nature, particularly plant growth, plant form, and plant metamorphosis. For example, any leaf of a tree is going to be uniquely different if you measured it in terms of form, but in terms of the fundamental geometric unfolding process that's happening, each leaf is participating in the same kind of life pattern. And so that's one of the aspects, I guess, that sheds light on natural geometry, which is huge potential. Obviously, plants don't measure, but there's a pattern. There's a fundamental, but fundamentally, Euclid's fifth postulate, which is what makes everything that doesn't use this postulate non-Euclidean geometry. His fifth postulate was essentially that parallel lines will never meet. They'll simply go on forever, and that's that. But turns out if you look at things in a certain way and you do some of the exercises, I will ideally, hopefully, prove to you, or rather provide the experiences for you to prove to your own self that mentally that's true. Parallel lines will intersect. It's just that they intersect at infinity. And that means there's a point at infinity where these lines meet. And you could take it even further and say two planes would intersect in an infinitely distant line. And even we could talk about parallel spaces, but it's getting ahead of ourselves. But that's one of the notions where if someone comes to you and says, parallel lines intersect, you probably are like, yeah, I don't know about that. I think I'm not just gonna accept you saying that, right? You shouldn't, right? But it's entirely provable, but you might have to abandon your conceptual notion of truth. And it's worth it, trust me. So I guarantee after the course, should you take it, you will believe that parallel lines intersect. That requires drawing, So this course, when I think about what I do with this course, I think of myself as a trail guide. I'm not here to teach actually anything as much as just provide the opportunity to allow the geometry to teach you, to experience the natural lawful patterns on your own, because you have to create it, witness it, and participate in its unfolding. Okay. A few things. I know I'm missing a couple elements, but that's always going to happen. Anything else, Chaitali?
Thank you, Jeremy. This is such a big challenge in itself that, the statement that parallel lines intersect, it is like an unbelievable statement. And I was even in awe of this when I was doing this course with you and I learned how do they intersect. And it was like you say, it is with the drawing. This is the geometry of process. And through the process, it opens up not just the challenge, but several other ways, several other visions um, in the process of doing something. So for me, this has been a very eye-opening experience. Um, and now I would like to open the floor for questions and comments and discussions, really to all the participants. If what do you feel about this? If you have any questions, more about the topic, or how would we be in this process together? Please feel free to question and comment.
For me,
Hi, Chetan.
Hi, Samrish.
No, no, let Alice go ahead. Yeah.
no, it's just for me, like you mentioned the two different geometry, Euclidean and non-Euclidean, and when you mentioned them, they really sound obvious to you. But this, I mean, and you explained a bit the difference between the two, but these words are not so obvious for me because they're really new. So maybe if you could go a bit deeper about where they come from. And what I like is also I would like to hear you about it in the fact that the way you mention it is very binary. The fact that or you have Euclidean or you have non-Euclidean as if you have only black and white. And there would be the gray zone, for example, as well, because I have the impression that we see the word very binary. And I think this is also part of the problem. So yeah, I would like to have your insight for that.
Yeah, no, I really don't like the name non-Euclidean. It's just, saying my name is not John. That's my brother's name. It's like, well, that's not a name. It's just the absence of a name. Um, but unfortunately, it hasn't really acquired a sort of separate identity. So yeah, I think what you're pointing at is a good thing to address, that this geometry it's not like a binary. It's Euclidean geometry is essentially a binary geometry. It's essentially a way of distinguishing subject and object, and the what I like to call archetypal geometry, which is also known as projective geometry. Once upon a time, it was called synthetic geometry. But then I question whether or not to even call it geometry, because people also have this idea that geometry looks a certain way. And this is a I mean, we use points and lines and we're drawing with pencils and straight edges and things. So in that sense, it's the geometry, it's an activity that's familiar. Um, but you're right in the sense that everything that's not included in Euclidean geometry is just thrown in this other category, and it's called non-Euclidean. But there are multiple types of non-Euclidean geometry, all of them with different sort of assumptions. You assume one certain thing to be true, and you have this type. You assume another thing. It has to do with the curvature of space. Um, and but that so my approach is really to just open up, yeah, the whole gray area. It's like everything. How do we get into that completely non-binary form of geometry, which takes many different appearances? So that's essentially what the geometry is moving into yeah, the non-binary. And ultimately what I find is this geometry can highlight how much that binary is embedded in our systems of thought. not just in our physics, but even in our sociology and our there's just so many levels of human activity that are embedded with a fundamentally binary system of thinking. And to me, this geometry is an antidote to that, um, because it's so deeply embedded in our education and our system of thought that it's hard to even get it out. Um, so yeah, to me, it's a huge aspect. And I'm glad you brought it up. Is but even non-binary is still like a, same kind of definition. So but we lack the language really. We're evolving, we're changing, and um, a lot of the language we use is built around these concepts. So we have to sort of use them to get outside of them. But hopefully, in the near future or sometime in the future, we'll evolve the language as well, so we can talk about these things. But yeah, it's good. Yeah.
And I guess we will also explore this in deep, right? Like what is and what is not when we discuss in depth about polarity and dualities in the course. So if anybody is interested to explore this in depth, I suggest joining the course because we will be learning this also. Samarish, you had a question?
Yeah, sorry, my camera is not working. So I wanted to actually, it seems, thanks, Jeremy. I mean, the description, the introduction, even if it lacked, it lacked the, I mean, I could sense the general difficulty in being able to put everything in words, and in that sense, it sounds really interesting. Actually, it sounds little, I should say, something one needs to explore by by doing it or by learning it. Um, I was curious about that, where you know where you said that our general sense of reality will also be challenged in the normal sense that we perceive reality. Was wondering if it is related to how you experience consciousness, all that. I mean, I'm just feeling interested in knowing more.
That's a good question. One of the aspects of this geometry is, like I said, the what it's hard to into words, but essentially every form that we encounter doesn't exist in isolation. It exists within a large context. Um, just to keep a simple example, if we have a square or a triangle on a piece of paper, we tend to think of that as this thing. It's just a noun. That's just it's just a thing that lives there. Even though really when you get down to it, it's an idea. You can't really have a triangle in paper, right? It's the idea of a triangle. Um but that triangle doesn't exist without the lines that have woven together to intersect and create that form. But also that triangle lives in a larger context. It lives in a larger world of a geometric sort of scaffold or a geometric framework out of which any sort of form emerges. But what we tend to get taught, we don't get taught about context. We don't get taught about the sort of relational aspect between the form, the context it in, and then also the element is perspective, where what is something that's a byproduct. Ultimately, the goal to me, at least in terms of, is move to a place where we start to recognize the truth of what lives in every possible perspective, right? So we live in a world now that privileges certain perspectives. And if you have that perspective, then you have more power, more um, ability to move in the world, more, freedom, more rights a lot of times. So there's certain perspectives that get validated more than others. And if what this, to me, the consciousness that this geometry invites is this awareness of the truth that lives across multiple perspectives. It's almost like seeing things from different points of view, not abandoning perspective, but transcending a limited point of view to see things from multiple points of view. That isn't just a geometry experience, it's fundamentally a quality of consciousness that you cultivate by doing these exercises. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. Multiple perspectives.
Multiple perspectives. Yeah.
Mhm.
What geometry does, conventional Euclidean Cartesian geometry, this curious thing where there is a perspective. Not you're standing, say, at the origin point in a Cartesian coordinate. It doesn't make any difference standing there or standing 5 units away or 6 units away. It's part of what makes it possible to then, destroy a forest or pollute a river or, um, you know, impact our environment. I hope I'm not offending any scientists out there. I'm a scientist myself. To me, this is a part of science, actually.
How did you got interested into all this, Jeremy?
Yeah, well, it started with a general recognition that the paradigm we were living in, to me, wasn't really working very well for most people. Um, and it was exploring sort of alternatives and like getting into um, agriculture and farming, specifically Rudolf Steiner's biodynamics. Maybe I'll and he was the one in the early 20th century who was suggesting that people look more deeply at projective geometry. Um, and so I had teachers that opened me up to that, and then I was so enamored and intrigued that I studied it further, and then I was teaching it to students, and then to high school students, and then ultimately I went to study in grad school sort of the philosophy of mathematics, and how this um, has great potential. That's sort of a briefly. That's a huge aspect to me, is the not just um, an exercise in geometry, but the application of this to transform our relationship to plants and how we grow and design and cultivate plants, is recognizing that there's other forces at work, other than simply gravity and electricity and magnetism in your traditional, molecular view of things. there's a whole nother layer of another dimension, you could say, of living forces, etheric forces, some might call, or vital forces. I mean, we see this in other forms of medicine besides Western medicine. We see Ayurveda, uh, Taoist, Chinese medicine. See the traditional sort of old European. I don't know what the word for that might be. Witchcraft, pagan or neo-pagan medicine, where the elements and the stars, the planets, and yeah. So all these others that have been known and worked with for thousands of years. This is, to me, is a way of bringing a geometric validation to it all.
Jeremy, there's been a comment in the chat from Sandhya. Sandhya, if you are here, I encourage you to unmute and ask. And then we also have a question from Gaurav after we have Sandhya's question.
Hello,
Hi.
this is Sandhya. It sounds very fascinating and interesting, but I know when for something so vast, it may be difficult, but I still wanted to ask. An example would provide a lot of clarity, like an example of how things are in a regular geometry. And I mean, I suppose we shouldn't be call it regular, but and what you're explaining,
Yeah,
I don't know if it's possible, but like that would help me.
it is tricky. Yeah, we could perhaps, maybe we'll have to schedule a short exercise at some point, and we can do a drawing, or even the course that we're doing in January, where we'll go more deeply. Um, if you're, yeah, and I realize that language isn't necessarily always the same, but maybe, I don't know if you could, I don't know if that shows up when you see your typical
Yes.
graph paper, right?
Yeah.
We're all familiar with this. This is the Euclidean world. This is the
Yes.
um, and if I go to San Francisco or to some other city or look at buildings or office buildings and things, you'll see just right angles everywhere. And to get out of sight of that, you have to draw something where you see things in movement. So, for example, I got this little drawing.
Yeah.
I don't know if you could see that. One thing you can see, hopefully, if
Yes.
there's enough
Yes.
light,
Yes, I can see.
is that none of these rectangles are the same.
Yeah.
Each one is unique.
Yes.
And that uniqueness is a quality of where these points are and how this drawing was constructed. And this drawing is very related. Trying to get that lined up. Up. Okay. If you can see here, actually,
Yeah.
there's a uniformity happening that if you look horizontally, the lengths of the quadrilaterals are equal in any horizontal line.
Okay.
So these drawings are actually the same drawing. It's just that this one happens to have one of its fundamental points, one of these points up here, which is generating this pattern. One of those points is actually at infinity and it's parallel. So all those lines that are coming in horizontally that are parallel, those are actually emanating from a point at infinity. And as a consequence, we see regular divisions but these drawings, the process to unfold these drawings is the same. And so when we put certain elements at infinity, it introduces a regularity um, that wouldn't normally be there without it. So I know it's a bit of a leap, but this drawing here,
Yeah.
if you move all points to infinity, you will have the right grid. That's the only way you'll get that. Like back to this paper.
Okay.
So what this geometry kind of demonstrates is that this Cartesian paper, this is a subset of possibilities. This is a very limited case of a general universal pattern. It's not um, it's not fundamental to the nature of space. But when we design buildings and when we shape space with a bunch of right angles and uniform measurements and equal divisions all the time, well, that reinforces this experience of space like that, which is essentially, yeah, kind of dead and static, not alive and dynamic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Sandhya and Jeremy. We are almost closer to the end of the webinar, but we have a question
Oh,
from
no.
Gaurav. Gaurav, would you like to unmute and briefly ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy, for your explanation. I think I kind of get a bit of insight on how I'm understanding it is that when we look at a space, rather than looking at it as in right angles, we can look at it at a much deeper dimension, like maybe fractals, how we see fractals, and make a more complex uh, design while kind of keeping it simple. I mean, that's a bit of insight that I think I get from it.
Yeah, I think you said fractals. It's a little hard to hear. Yeah, to me, that would be one of the goals, I guess, or the applications is introducing elements into our spaces that are, yes, simple geometric design ideas that abandon these right angles and parallel structures. And to me, the goal of that would be to provide a reflection in our space around us and to ultimately kind of make it possible to be conscious of the presence of forces and layers of reality that are streaming and surrounding us from a wider cosmos. And a lot of that can take place with the use of curves and through the cutting certain corners, certain angles. Just it's a right angle and the parallel structures which sort of invite this disconnection. But by abandoning that, by using different principles, and it doesn't have to be really complicated, it it just fundamentally can change the experience of that space um, to bring to awareness these other layers and other places at work in the world. And I'm sure I'll experience this if you've ever went to a town space into a I don't know, a lot of times temples or religious sacred structures work with this a lot. So how can we make, every space we inhabit sacred, essentially, or open to that which flows in sacred spaces, not to simply say, oh, we go over here to these, certain buildings for one experience, and then we go home and we live in these other kinds of buildings. Um, how do we break down again a sort of binary? How do we make it so that our spaces everywhere are imbued with a sense of that connection? Right? And I think it starts, at least one example is one way to cultivate a consciousness of that so that we can utilize it is to experience geometry in a totally new way, at least new for most of us. I hope that answered your question.
Gaurav
I forgot
says
to mention
thank you
fractals.
in the
That's a whole
chat.
thing.
Oh, sorry. Go on, Jeremy.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I just
Okay.
one thing about fractals is fractals are self-replicating. They're designs that are built out of itself, and that's a very similar quality as this with introduced measurement, we see this lawful pattern emerging through through the process itself. So that is very resonant. That's a lot of what we do, is allowing things to come alive and speak to us in a way. Are we out of time? Oh, it is that time.
Yeah. And also, a lot of these things will come into clarity once we start doing things with our hands. And to answer questions of Gaurav and Sandhya, which were more application based, I guess the applications will come to us when we are aware, right? This is also a geometry of awareness. So once we are aware as designers, that awareness then reflects into our design, and we will get into its depth as we progress in the course. And also, if there are any further questions or comments, I request anybody who has a question to stay back. But in the interest of time of others, let me bring this to the close and also share a couple of things. So if anybody is interested to join the short course, please find the link in the chat. And also for all of you, I have a special 1,000 rupees off for the course. You can use the coupon code FIRST6 when you are signing up. And also, I request you to kindly fill in the feedback form, which is in the chat. And if you are interested to stay in touch and, keep conversing about these ideas or learn new ideas, we are creating a Land and Site Discord group. So you may please join it through the link. And also, I'm sharing a couple of links to our social media. So you can join us there on social media as well. And I want to really thank Jeremy and all of you all for joining. As we close, I invite you to reflect. My internet just went off. Anyway,
You
so
were
that was
inviting us to do something.
oh, okay. So yeah, I was just saying that, we think about how many right angles we're surrounded with and how often do we embrace the organic geometries of nature. That geometry isn't just lines and shapes, it's a guide to connection. And by aligning with these natural patterns, we could design spaces and lives that are not only functional but deeply meaningful. And I've also put Frank Lloyd Wright's quote in the chat, which is, without an architecture of our own, we have no soul of our own civilization. So, with this, I would like to bring this to an end. And if anybody still has any questions, concerns, comments, please feel free to ask. Or if you would like to leave, please feel free to do so as well.
Thank you, everybody.
I have one short thing that I wanted to ask.
Yes.
Many of whom credited projective geometry, which is just another name for this, as the basis for their revolutionary insight. And so to me, I don't know how you would look at quantum physics today and say, look at what quantum physics has done for us. I'm not sure entirely what that is. Um, but I think about all of the students, all the children, all the people around the world, um, and what kind of inventions, what kind of design elements, what kind of technologies could be discovered with a whole different kind of relationship to viewing space and the forces that work in that space. Right. So without that imagination, without those ideas, to me, there's the technology is limited. For example, one of the field of biomimicry, where people look to the designs of nature to sort of solve, human problems usually. Um, but that design is oftentimes it's imitation is what it is. It's mimicry. It's simply copying what nature is doing. This geometry opens up a way of grasping how nature is doing what it's doing. How can we tap into those geometric principles in a totally creative way? What we could design out of that is still yet to be discovered. So in that sense, there's a potential for actual like physical technologies, design. Um, yeah. So that's what I think of anyway, that working with new kinds of forces could open up energy production or energy utilization or more efficient. And there are a couple examples like that we will talk about in the course of people who have done that. Any
Yeah, something like what it, I mean, I have heard in another, by what J. Krishnamurti would say, the word water will not quench your thirst.
yeah, that's a good one. I'll remember that one.
Yeah, thank you. Chetale is gone. I don't see her.
I am here,
Oh
but my
no,
internet is unstable.
Okay.
You all hear me well, right?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Are there any further questions or comments from anybody? Or Samrish, even you, if you have
No,
anything you
nothing. I think, yeah, that's fine. Thanks.
All right. Shall we bring it to a close?
For now, anyway.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. And if anybody has any further questions or any comments or reflections later, please do get in touch. You have Land Insight's email ID from which you have received this email, the link to this call, and I will make sure to forward it to Jeremy. And thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Jeremy. And let's hope
Yeah.
we have good signups for the course.
Yeah, I'm very excited.
Me too.
Every time we go on this journey, it's just an adventure. It's it's an experience unlike anything else. To yeah, come and try it.
Yes.